When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation.
These familiar words are not only a part of American history, they also have their own history. In the late spring of 1776, delegates to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia were meeting 6 days a week well into the night, struggling to forge a consensus about how to respond to British actions of the preceding years.
The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
The Declaration of Independence leveled 29 specific grievances against King George III, holding him accountable for the Stamp Act,
for imposing taxes on us without our consent,
the Quartering Act,
for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us,
the Boston Massacre,
for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit,
the closure of Boston Harbor,
for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world,
and ultimately for the military skirmishes that had broken out between colonial Minutemen and British soldiers at Lexington and Concord.
He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us.
In the wee hours of April 19, 1775, on the village green at Lexington, Massachusetts, British troops in search of an arms cache confronted a gathering of sleepy American militiamen recently awakened by the midnight ride of Paul Revere.
Lay down your arms, you damned rebels, and disperse!
The battles of Lexington and Concord were interpreted and reinterpreted at the time as an attack by the British on the defenseless Americans. Of course, they weren't utterly defenseless. The reason for the attack was that they were mounting a defense and maintaining a munitions collection at Concord, and the British spies knew this, and that was their intention on marching on the city to try to capture those supplies. So everyone knew that trouble was going to happen. The only question is when and where it would happen. Lexington and Concord in 1775 were the beginning of the battles of the American Revolution. England had brought an army to Boston, and Boston was occupied for some months by this hostile force. But this was the first taking up of arms, the first shot that was fired in the classic sense. And once that happened, the war had started. I mean, the revolution had begun.
Having fired on British troops, the colonists needed the Declaration to justify their actions and establish the legitimacy of the revolution. The Declaration portrayed King George as a merciless tyrant.
He has refused to pass. He has refused to assent to prevent the population of these states. Representative houses.
The Declaration of Independence makes George the target finally, and this was an enormously important shift. Up until then, the Acts of Parliament had been complained about, and Americans had operated under the fiction that the king's evil ministers were giving him bad advice, and that Parliament was doing bad things, and if only Parliament would change its ways, things would be better. The Declaration of Independence took on the king, square and directly. It wasn't the very first thing to do that.
Earlier, in the same year, Common Sense, a pamphlet written in fiery prose by an Englishman, Thomas Paine, had spread like wildfire through the colonies.
Tom Paine called King George an ass, the royal brute of Britain, and he wrote the book in language that wasn't weighted with weighty philosophical and political science type arguments, but was written in very direct language that ordinary Americans could understand.
Small islands not capable of protecting themselves are the proper objects for kingdoms to take under their care. But there is something very absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island.
And it sold many, many copies very quickly, passed from hand to hand, widely distributed, read aloud in taverns, and made a powerful case for the independence, the inevitable independence of the American colonies.